What's up, guys? It's Jesse here from Matt Apps, and today we're going to be talking about Arjan Bullhar, the Indo-Canadian who just this past week, well, actually a couple weeks ago, they just aired it though. Um, he won actually on the 28th of April, but they just aired it this past weekend. Um, Beat Brandon Vera for the 1FC heavyweight title. For those of you who aren't aware, 1FC is probably the biggest promotion in Asia right now. There's 1FC, there's Risen, which is mostly in Japan. And that, as far as like big promotions, is pretty much it. So 1FC is probably the biggest promotion in Asia right now. They have a lot of the top talent. Their heavyweight division is one of the thinner divisions. They tend to be more stacked in the smaller divisions, but it is considered like one of the major MMA titles, not as prestigious as the UFC title, especially at heavyweight. Aaron, being the number one ranked 1FC heavyweight now, is still only ranked 49th out of all heavyweights in the world, according to Fight Matrix. He's not even the highest ranked Canadian, actually. Tanner Bose is at 35th. He's still in the UFC. Just recently lost to Arlovsky. He's fighting Ilir Latifi soon, which could bump him up quite a bit because I think Ilir's like number 8 in the world right now. Yeah, Bullhar just beat Vera, who's ranked number 2 in 1FC, 111th in the world. So heavyweight isn't one of the most stacked divisions in 1FC. They tend to be more in the lighter weight classes. A lot of the better heavyweights outside of the UFC tend to be in either Bellator or Cage Warriors, Cage Rage, like a lot of the European shows. What's that other one? The European one, M1 Global, Moscow Fight Club. There's a bunch of different European ones, and like a lot of the heavyweights tend to come from Europe and North America, South America. So Jungle Fights, another good one out of Brazil. But yeah, 1FC tends to be a little bit thinner. Risen actually has a lot of good heavyweights too. Most of them are foreigners. They don't, not a lot of actual Japanese fighters. They bring in a lot of foreigners, but they tend to have a fairly good heavyweight program. But yeah, I think it's definitely big for Bullhar, that's for sure, and for India as a whole. I've seen a lot of Canadians, both white Canadians and Indian Canadians, that are kind of pissed off that Bullhar is representing himself as an Indian, and I kind of understand that. You have like the white Canadians that are like, oh, so you don't, they're mad that he like doesn't view himself as Canadian, or at least that's how they see it. And then you have the Indo-Canadians, like the Canadians of Indian descent, and they're like, oh, they're mad because kind of in a way for the same reason, except it's a little bit different. It's like, oh, so even if we were born here, we're not Canadian still. But I think that's kind of a bad way of looking at it, just because GSP, who's arguably the GOAT, is a Canadian fighter. And because of that, MMA is already huge in Canada. We've already had 2 champions in the UFC, which is the biggest promotion. We've had 2 guys that were number 1 in the world at their weight class. Carlos Newton was the champion, took it from Pat Miletich, lost it to Matt Hughes. And then St. Pierre, obviously, was the 2-weight champion, the 170 champion and the 185-pound champion, considered one of the greatest ever, if not the greatest ever. So MMA is already insanely popular in Canada. India, on the other hand, hasn't really had any success at the highest level. Bullhar's probably their best fighter pound for pound. They don't really produce a lot of high-level talent. I know there's a girl that's fighting in 1FC that is supposed to be a really good prospect. So that could be interesting. We could see her come on to do some stuff. But as of right now, I think it's really smart for the sport, and especially for 1FC being a mostly Asian-based promotion, to market him as an Indian, because you have 1.5 billion people there. I think it's like 1.6, 1.7 billion people, somewhere around there. And they don't really have that many sports superstars, at least not for international sports. Like, they're pretty big at cricket, but like cricket's not really big outside of India and like Australia and Britain. Like, there's like 3-4 countries that play cricket, so nobody gives a fuck, right? So I think, if they have a really big international celebrity in Bullhar, in a combat sport that's like a widely viewed combat sport, I think that'll be huge for one, the sport, and 2, for the country, because one, it's going to be an outlet where a lot of people think like, hey, this might be the thing where I can become talented at this sport, and then that'll kind of boost morale in the country on one hand, and then on the other hand, for the sport, you now have another 1.6, 1.7 billion people size talent pool to pull from, even more if you can count the diaspora, because there's a lot of Indians in Canada, the U.S., Britain, Australia, the Caribbean, like pretty much anywhere that's like former British Empire. There's a lot of Indians there. They moved around a lot during the British Empire days, and then also recently. That nearly probably getting close to 2 billion people when you talk about all the diaspora. That's a lot of talent to pull from if they can get all those people, hyped up to want to watch this guy. Do I think 1FC is the way to do it? And like, is 1FC big enough to do it? Probably not. I know they're pretty big in Asia, but if you just look at the social media numbers, it's not even comparable to the UFC. Like, they have maybe a tenth, if that, of the following on social media. And I know that a lot of Asian countries, especially China, have their own social media platforms. Well, I should say almost exclusively China, because the most other countries just use the same social media that we use in the West. They just have their own languages for it. China is really the only one that kind of develops their own social media because they want their own internal system. But 1FC, even though it is big in Asia, it's 1FC in Asia is like Bellator is here. Even there, they recognize that the UFC is the highest level promotion. All the top guys try to get to the UFC. That's where you go to if you want to be the number one. Like, the UFC has every lineal championship right now is in the UFC except the 115-pound championship. That was until they just cut Jared Brooks, because they don't have a 115-pound division. They had him fighting at 125. So if you want to be the best in the world, you have to go to the UFC. So I think, and people know that, so people tend to view the UFC as the big title, because it is the big title, because they've been able to unify the lineal titles and the UFC titles. But if Bullhar comes back to the UFC, because when he left, he was 3-1, and he was on a 2-fight winning streak. The division's looking really thin right now. They just cut Overeem. They just cut JDS. Verdum left to go fight in the PFL tournament. He'll probably come back after that, I'd assume, but he wants to crack at that $1 million. I think, I doubt he'll be able to beat like an Ngannou or a Stipe or any of those guys, but being the 1FC champion, if he was able to come back and at least go on a decent run at heavyweight in the UFC, I think that'd be really good. Already being 3-1, winning the 1FC title, he could probably get a lot of money too. And like, when you look at how big the WWE is in India, it's absolutely massive. Like, a lot of that has to do with like the Great Khali and stuff like that. They had a lot of big Indian wrestlers, specifically him. He's the biggest one that comes to mind. A lot of that fan base will transfer over because the sports are very similar, right? Like, a lot of people knock on the WWE and they're like, oh, it's not a real sport because it's, it's predetermined. And I would agree with that. It's not a sport, but it's definitely a martial art, right? Like, it's no different than when you see like martial artists in movies like Bruce Lee and stuff doing choreographed stuff. It's like, yeah, of course it's fake, but like, that doesn't mean he can't really throw kicks and shit, right? And we've seen guys transfer over and have success from wrestling too. I think people, they don't really give WWE the credit it deserves to a certain extent because it's predetermined. But like, there's a lot of freak athletes in that, and like, a lot of those guys were actually fighters. Like, Ken Shamrock and Tank Abbott started as fighters, then went to the WWE. Brock Lesnar was a collegiate wrestler. Kurt Angle was an Olympic wrestler. Who else? They had Manny Yarbrough for a while. He was the world sumo champion and a UFC fighter. Like, a lot of those guys have legitimate backgrounds. Bobby Lashley was a really good collegiate wrestler, ended up having an MMA career after. Ironically, people kind of look at CM Punk and think he is like the stereotype of the WWE guy coming over to MMA, but he's actually much more the exception to the rule. Those guys actually generally do fairly well. A lot of them are bigger guys, right? And they're really athletic. They're like ex-football players, ex-college wrestlers, ex-Olympians, whatever they did. So when they're big and they're athletic, so when they transfer to heavyweight, they have an advantage over a lot of the guys that they're fighting, because they're fighting guys that are like 250 pounds and fat that really shouldn't be fighting at heavyweight but are fighting at heavyweight. And So they do tend to do well. CM Punk being the obvious exception. But then again, he was one of the few guys that didn't have a legitimate athletic background, right? Like, he wasn't a fucking all-star college football player that came over, or an all-star college wrestler that came over, the fucking gold medal Olympian like Kurt Angle was, right? He was just the WWE guy. He was never an athlete before that, so it makes sense that he wasn't able to transfer over because he didn't really have the skills to transfer over. But yeah, if Bullhar can and Bullhar has actually said that he wants to compete in either the WWE or WCW or something, in one of those big promotions. He could possibly do New Japan Pro Wrestling. I think they're still around. I don't really know. I don't follow wrestling too much, but I know they're really big in Asia, or used to be really big in Asia. So if he's able to, kind of get that pro wrestling crowd hyped up and into him, and then come back into the UFC and possibly make a run at the title, that would be absolutely amazing. And being an Olympian for Team Canada, he's actually done pretty well for himself. He has a gold medal at the Commonwealth Games, bronze medal at the Pan America Games, bronze medal at the World University Games, gold medal at the FILA Grand Prix, gold medal at the Pan American Olympic Qualifying Tournament. And then in college wrestling, he has 2 gold medals in the Canadian National Wrestling for the collegiate level, like our version of the NCAAs. He has a bronze medal, and then he also has a CIS, which is the way it's done in Canada is a little bit different. So CIS is actually, I guess we would say, more like our NCAAs, and then the NAIA, I think, is the one that you actually compete. Yeah, it's the one where you compete against the Americans as well. But it's only certain universities that compete against each other. So yeah, one is like a North American league. Basically, he's got 2 golds and a bronze, and the other one is the Canadians. He has a gold medal. So very, very high level wrestler. Trains at AKA with Daniel Cormier and Cain Velasquez and Luke Rockhold and all those guys. So comes from a really good wrestling pedigree, really good gym. Honestly, the only knock I'd probably have to say on him is that the guy is a little small for the weight class. But that never stopped guys like Cormier and Cain from winning, so that it is possible that he could do it. But he is also getting up there in age. He's already 35. And while at heavyweight the guys tend to age a lot later, like you'll see guys at heavyweight fighting well into their 40s. Randy Couture won the title at like 45 or 46. So generally heavyweights fight older. You'll see lighter guys, they're done their career by the time they're 28. Like a 125 or 135 pounder, like they're basically like an old man by the time they're 28. But then you look at a heavyweight and they're not even coming into their prime until their mid 30s. So, maybe we might see the best Bullhar yet, or we might see him kind of fade. It really depends on how well he ages. Being a heavyweight does kind of suggest that he still has a little bit, if not quite a bit, left in him. He might be able to get another 10 years out, especially because he's only 11 or 12 fights in, and he's been on the winning end of most of those fights. The one fight he has lost is by submission, so he hasn't really been getting beat up, which again helps with longevity of the career. But yeah, if he can keep training at AKA, if he can, maybe rack up a couple defenses in one, then come back to the UFC, maybe get some pro wrestling in there to hype up the fans, and really, I guess it depends on what his goal is. If his goal is to be the best in the world, he's got to get back to the UFC and win that title. But I think the fact that he left the UFC for one championship means that his goal isn't to be the best in the world, or at least he isn't worried about that right now. And he seems to be far more worried about expanding the sport into India, which I think is great. So I think marketing him as an Indian is good for the company, and it's good for the sport, for the company, because they're based in Asia. They're trying to really I don't know if they're trying to, but they're really becoming like the top Asian feeder promotion to the UFC, and so for them to get like this big Indian star and market him as an Indian star is smart. Because they're probably not going to be able to compete with like Bellator and the UFC when it comes to North America. So if they market him as a Canadian, it'd be really hard to market him, especially as the world champion, because Canadian fans are so ingrained into the UFC that like they'd just kind of laugh at the people calling him the world champion. Um, and so yeah, and then from the perspective of the sport, I think just more Indian fans is good because we saw with Habib, with Connor, with Joanna, whenever a country gets their first champion, the sport just really blows up there. Um, Especially a first dominant champion. Sometimes they get like a one and done champion and the sport really doesn't blow up like Canada. We had Carlos Newton. The Netherlands has had two champions, Bas Rutten and Jermaine Durandamine, and it really hasn't blown up too much there. They still produce a lot of good fighters, especially a lot of good heavyweights. But most of those are transfers over from their top-tier kickboxing programs, including Rutten and Durandamine, who are both top-level kickboxers. Alistair Overeem was a world champion kickboxer, although actually he kind of went the other way. He started in judo, then went to MMA, then went to kickboxing. But most of those top Netherlands, Dutch fighters, they come out of the kickboxing program because of the long history of kickboxing. They're into MMA now, the other way around. And McGregor obviously blew it up there, but he was a one and done champion. But he did that twice, and he is such a huge star even before he was champion. And Ireland is such a fight country. Khabib obviously blew up in Russia. Adesanya and Usman in Nigeria, and then more recently, what's his name? Big guy, Francis Ngannou, in Cameroon. So, but yeah, I think overall this is it's great for the sport. Great for him, obviously. Won a title. And yeah, it's just all around good. So, like, comment, subscribe, and I'll see you later.